places. وَالْأَزْمِنَةِ, of places and times. وَالْأَشْخَاص, and people. And special times, special places, special people can be a catalyst. Can be a catalyst. Right? What is barakah? Barakah is, they say, is the sirru ziyadati fil umur, is the secret of increase in matters. But increase only matters if there's something underlying your reality. Right? There has to be something there to be catalyzed. Right? The ziyada تكون على عن أساس. There's a foundation, and this gives an increase. So the believer seeks out these blessed opportunities. In our day-to-day, there are blessed opportunities in our daily prayer. It's a time. It's one of the khawas, al-awqat. Is the times of the obligatory prayers. We have blessed times that passes by each day, such as waqt al-fajr, the time of fajr, the time of duha, the discretionary time, but there's opportunity there. There's the opportunity of asr time. So Allah swears by subhanahu wa ta'ala, but of some worship during that time is blessed. The time between Maghrib and Isha is blessed, as we know from many hadiths of the Prophet ﷺ. And the night is socially dangerous and spiritually beneficial. نهى رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم عن السمر في الليل. The Prophet ﷺ forbade purposeless socializing at night. And we have a few answers on seekers that explain the parameters of that, but it's a reality. So, and then of course, the depths of the night. شيء من الدلجة, as the Prophet said. There's blessed times that the believer strives to make the most of in the day. But also there are blessed places in our day-to-day. Daily, the masjid is a blessed place. Daily, the majalis of ilm, of dhikr, these are blessed places. There are blessed people. When one meets believers, when one meets the righteous, when one meets the learned, and these are, in our day-to-day, these are catalysts that are opportunities of good. But in our day-to-day, there are also things that can hold one's back. Can hold one back. They're not necessarily bad, but how one interfaces with those things has a significant impact on our spiritual trajectory. So we know, for example, that the marketplace, the souq, is potentially a spiritually dangerous place. Which is why there is tremendous reward. The dua, dukhul al-souq, the dua for entering the marketplace, has so much reward to it. Because someone can enter the marketplace conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and make that consistent, that is more transformative than most acts of most nawafil. Why? Because that is the state of those whom Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala describes in Ayat al-Nur, that رِجَالٌ لَا تُلْهِيهِمْ تِجَارَةٌ وَلَا بَيْعٌ عَنْ ذِكْرِ اللَّهِ. Accomplished ones who neither trade nor transaction busies away from the remembrance of Allah and the rest of their duties of submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So these are matters. So there's nothing wrong with the souq, and the souq refers to two things primarily. One is the place of work. The place of work, because that is where you are. Whether you're buying and selling, but the souq is where people go to work. And the other is the places where when you go shopping. So work and shopping, the dua dukhul as-suq applies to both, but both your work time and the time when you go shopping, right? So you enter the mall or whatever, the dua dukhul as-suq applies to that because these are places where a lot of harmful or heedless choices take place. But there's nothing, it can be an obligation for some people to be working. If unless you're planning on growing your own food, you do kind of have to go shopping too. But one needs to approach these with caution. Similarly, the washroom needs to be approached with caution because it's a place of heedlessness. It takes time, it's a drain on time. Then spiritually, being a place inevitably where there's najasa around, there are meanings of, there are places where, as we'll see from the hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, in what we will be reading, there are places where shayateen can gather. Where shayateen can gather. So, that is why, it's a place where one needs to be careful, one, not to waste undue time in the washroom. There's a drain on time. It's not a place made for the remembrance of Allah. That goes against the very purpose of our existence, right? Which is to be in states of devotedness to Allah. Potentially, people can do a lot of foolish things in the washroom too, right? Because sometimes privacy can be rare, and the washroom is a place where you can get privacy, so people harm themselves, practically in the washroom. But those are realities. And then, given the presence of filth, then there's a spiritual reality, because Allah has created this world with light and darkness. Right? But there's a mitigating aspect, which is the washroom is a place to particularly pay attention to keeping clean. Especially in terms of najasa, etc., but generally, because it's a place susceptible to waswasa arising from it. The presence of shayateen. They don't come around with advertising signs. We are here, right? Okay. But one needs to be careful, which is why, out of mercy, the Prophet ﷺ has given us mafatih, keys to have consciousness of Allah and purposefulness in entering the washroom. So let's see what Imam الشرنبلالي رحمه الله has to say. قال الإمام الشرنبلالي رحمة الله تعالى عليه ونفعنا به وبكم ويدخل الخلاء برجله اليسرى. One enters the washroom with the left foot, and khala, the word, he says, ممدودا المتوضأ يعني مكان الوضوء والمراد به بيت التغوط, the place where one relieves oneself. And now المتوضأ, what is meant here, متوضأ يعني المكان الذي يتوضأ فيه. Imam Tahtawi makes clear that what's meant by wudu here is al-ma'na al-lughawi, which is mutlaqul ghasl, not the specific meaning of the place where wudu is done. Which is why he says, rahimahullah, وَلَوْ اخْتَصَرَ عَلَى قَوْلِهِ الْمُرَادِ بَيْتُ التَّغَوُّطِ لَكَانَ أَوْلَى. That if he just stuck to the second part, that al-khala, al-murad, bayt al-taghawwud would be sufficient. And al-khala, why is it called bayt al-khala? Right? one is because of this sense of khalwa, because one goes there and is alone. للاختلاء فيه. وأصله المكان الخالي الذي لا شيء فيه. It's the empty place where there is nothing. Right? So you go there, you're in a state of ikhtila, you're in a state of aloneness. Right? And classically, the Arabs, being desert people, they used to go away from the encampment, so they're alone. يعني في مكان خال عن الناس, a place free of other people. And there's other potential explanations here. Okay. برجله اليسرى ابتداء, meaning beginning with one's left foot. مستور الرأس, with one's head covered. This is recommended. It's recommended when one enters the washroom to have one's head covered, and it was noted from the practice of the Prophet ﷺ, but also from a number of the companions that they did that. Many of the ulama, what they do is if they're wearing a turban, for example, in their bag they would keep a kufi, because the nature of a turban is that it can be unwieldy in the washroom. So they take their turban off and they would put a cap on. And I've seen that with a number of the ulama. استحبابا. مستور الرأس استحبابا. It's a recommendation. Why? Because it's a place where one is seeking spiritual shielding, and and it also is expressed, part of covering one's head, is also, it expresses humility. Humility. That's why it's recommended for men as well.
Should women put on a hijab?
Yeah, but so if one's home, it doesn't have to be like full hijab, but to cover one's head, yes. This applies to both men and women, as the commentators mention. Mastura Ra's istihbab. Now, one thing to be careful about is that if one is wearing, it's become popular these days, one of these caps that's got a sandal of the Prophet ﷺ on it, that should not enter the toilet. You can enter the washroom in it, but if you're at the toilet, you should take it off. Right? Because this is a representation of the prophetic sandal. Right? And there's much that has been written about, so anything that becomes a symbol of the symbols of the religion, even if it's not a symbol at the time of the Prophet ﷺ necessarily, though many of the Sahaba used this as a point of reference. So for example, saying that Anas ibn Malik, what was he known as? صاحب نعل رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. He was a caretaker of the sandals of the Prophet ﷺ. The Sahaba described the shape of the na'al of Rasulullah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and there's a great history of deeming that of significance. Now, was there a green dome at the time of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam? Was there? Actually, even the dome wasn't green till not so long ago, historically. It was a particular shade of blue. Then later, the qubba only became khadra much later. Right? But anything that is connected, that is given now a connection with religion, has significance. It becomes one of the sha'air of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَمَن يُعَظِّمْ شَعَائِرَ اللَّهِ. Whoever has respect for the symbols of Allah, which is anything that points to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, or that points to something that has been made, that has been granted significance by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Right? Like the Messenger alayhi salatu. So, something like that should not enter the toilet area. استحبابا تكرمة لليمنى, to respect the right. لأنه مستقذر. لأن بيت الخلاء, لأنه أي الخلاء, because it, meaning the toilet, is considered unclean. يحضره الشيطان, that the devils enter. And here Imam Tahtawi says that it would have been better to make explicit that these are two reasons, right? One, that the place is mustaqdar. Secondly, يحضره الشيطان. Right? And so these are two reasons. And one can interpret that like لأنه مستقدر لأنه يحضره الشيطان. Right? One can consider that as being two khabars, right? Effectively. But making explicit with a waw, Imam al-Tahtawi agrees with a sayyid, as he says, in that being superior. ولهذا يستعيذ أن يعتصم بالله من الشيطان الرجيم قبل دخوله. And this is why, right? Because the next adab, one is one enters with the left. The second adab is يستعيذ بالله. But there is an order. Because it's a place that يحضره الشيطان, يستعيذ بالله منه, right? So يستعيذ أي يعتصم. Right? So what does يستعيذ mean? Now Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala commands us in the Quran to seek refuge in the shaitan. فاستعذ به من الشيطان الرجيم. Now interestingly, some of the Hanafis, because the Hanafis are very much, the commands of the Quran are considered decisive. What does the verse say? إذا قرأت القرآن فاستعذ به من الشيطان الرجيم. Now they said, well, literally, if you recite the Quran, and إذا قرأت القرآن, if you have recited the Quran, then, if you took it very literally, then it would mean that recite after you recited, then seek refuge. You say that would not make sense, and that would not be understood. So there, what's necessarily implicit, and this is a type of indication of the text called اقتضاء النص. Okay? That what is necessarily implicit in the text is إذا قرأت أي إذا أردت قراءة. If you seek to recite the Quran, فاستعذ, then seek refuge أي قبل القراءة, before your recitation. So I said that would be understood, because the purpose is you seek refuge from the shaitan, so he doesn't enter waswasa upon the action, which is the recitation. But the command, if someone says استعذ, seek refuge, the response to that would be أستعيذ بالله. فاستعذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. Someone orders you استعذ بالله, the response to the command would be أستعيذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. And so a minority of the Hanafis, and many early ones, said that the right way of making ta'awudh, the optimal way of making ta'awudh is أستعيذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. However, they said no, because it says استعذ, but it has either ijmal, non-detailing, or a type of non-detailing as to how you make isti'adha. That extent of the non-definition has been made, the Prophet ﷺ made bayan of it with his practice, what he taught us, to say أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم before recitation of the Quran. Right? And there's a few other ways one can seek refuge. What does يستعيذ mean? This root, the of ayn, waw, dhal, right? Right? Imam Tahtawi does explain this. Right? He quotes al-Misbah, al-Misbah al-Munir, يعني استعذت بالله وعذت به معاذا وعياذا اعتصمت. Right? اعتصم, to seek protection. Right? Which is the first meaning, which is the meaning given by Imam Shurmulal, اعتصم, to seek protection. وتحصنت, تحصنت from taking a hisn, to seek shelter, right? To seek fortified shelter. Right? وَاسْتَجَرْتُ بِهِ, and I seek his caring protection. They all revolve around caring protection. وَالْتَجَأْتُ بِهِ, and I turn to him in seeking protection. So it is to seek the protection, care, shelter, and isti'adha is also to make iltija, to rush to seek to be in the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أن تكون تحت حماية الله, to be under the protection of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. قبل دخوله, before entering the washroom. Right? So you say it. So overall, the ulama say there's three possibilities of when you could say it. It's either before you enter, or as you're entering, or upon entering. Okay? It's superior to do it outside, or while entering. Okay. So Imam al-Tahtawi gives some detail. He says, Al-awla al-tafsil, that it's superior, because Imam Shulban says, one says it before entering. What's superior is that if the place is mu'ad li dhalik, if it's a place specifically for relieving oneself, then one says it before entering. Okay? So it's a dedicated toilet. It's just sort of a and that would include sort of just like, if you're before entering the toilet stall, for example, one goes in, as before one goes in, one says, A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim, right? Or the specific dua that is mentioned. وَإِنْ كَانَ غَيْرَ مُعَدٍّ لَهُ, if the place wasn't specifically placed for as a toilet, which would be, for example, if one's camping and goes out in nature, or, and he doesn't mention this, but the same thing would apply in a multi-purpose toilet, like a washroom. So technically, even here, you have a sink. It's quite conceivable you just go to the toilet here at Seekers just to make wudu. So technically, the washroom here, we might call it a toilet, but it's not a toilet. It's a multi-purpose thing. It's got a sink and a toilet. So if you're just going to use the sink, technically there's no reason to say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim in terms of emphasis. The emphasis would be when you're using the toilet. Now you could say it before entering, just to be safe. Before entering, you could say it. Or you could say it before usage. Right? So if you're going to, you go inside before using the toilet, right? Qabla, before you start, like directing yourself to use the toilet, to say, to seek refuge from the shaitan, then. بالاعتبار الأعم, from the broader consideration that this is not, like, it's a place where that is used for toilet matters as well. If you said it before entering, that also fulfills the sunnah, right? What if you forgot? It's a useful detail Imam Tahtawi mentions. وَإِن نَسِيَ ذَلِكَ أَتَى بِهِ في نَفْسِهِ لَا بِلِسَانِهِ. If one forgets to say, make the isti'adha, seeking refuge, then one says it within oneself but not with one's tongue. And that would apply when one's at the toilet itself. As one's already begun uncovering or descent, or is one is seated on the toilet. At that time, one realized one didn't say A'udhu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. One says it, one makes istihdar of the ma'na within without saying it with the tongue. Okay, there's some detail related to قبل دخوله وقبل كشف عورته, and before uncovering was awrah, that's a descriptive detail or pointing to an ikhtiyar, either before entering or in the case of a multi-purpose facility قبل كشف عورته, before uncovering one's awrah. Now the specific emphasis in the hadiths is to make ta'awudh. But Imam Shurugulali mentions what some of the ulama have mentioned. ويقدم تسمية الله تعالى على الاستعاذة. One begins by the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by saying Bismillah, upon seeking refuge. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم يستر ما بين أعين الجن وعورات بني آدم إذا دخل أحدكم الخلاء أن يقول بسم الله. Because the Prophet ﷺ said that the veil between the eyes of the jinn and the nakedness of humans is that if one of you enters the toilet, to say by the name of Allah, Bismillah. The hadith is related by Tirmidhi and elsewhere. وَلِقَوْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ, because of what the Prophet ﷺ said, إِنَّ الْحُشُوشَ مُحْتَضَرَةٌ فإذا أتى أحدكم الخلاء فليقل أعوذ بالله من الخبث والخبائث. Right? That the hushush, the errant ones gather. So if one of you enters the toilet, then say أعوذ بالله من الخبث والخبائث. I seek refuge in Allah from the vile ones, male and female, meaning referring to the jinn. So this is one of the rare places where normally one says أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم, right? Ta'awudh, then tasmiyah. This is one of the few places where one would say Bismillah and then Allahumma a'udhu billahi min al-khubthi wal khaba'ith, right? And so one puts it in the opposite form. Now khubth, right, can be read, al-khubth is plural of khabith, wa huwa al-mu'dhi, is that which harms, right, of the shayateen. And the narration of the hadith has come both with the sukoon on the ba, khubth wal khaba'ith, or khubuth with a dhamma on the ba. Khubuth is the asl in the language, but the Arabs didn't like things that are too heavy, etc. on pronunciation. So this is takhfif, to lighten the pronunciation. They would accept takhfif. أعوذ بالله من الخبث والخبائث. I seek refuge in Allah from the vile ones, male and female. I seek refuge in Allah, what does it mean? I seek protection, shelter, to be in the fortress of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and I flee to Allah to be in His protection. Right? So these are related meanings. Right? And that's part of, so the ta'awudh expresses trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, reliance upon Him. إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينَ. That the isti'ana billahi is fil khayri wal shar. Right? Fil khayri, fil iqdami alayhi, وفي الشر في الابتعاد عنه. Right? In the good, when we direct ourselves to the good, we rely upon Allah. We make isti'ana. We seek the assistance of Allah in doing the good. We also seek the assistance of Allah in keeping from the ill. If the shaitan is a potential source of harm, we rely upon Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. وَالشَّيْطَانُ مَعْرُوف. The shaitan is known. As C.S. Lewis says, one of the greatest tricks of the devil in the modern age is that he convinces people that it doesn't exist. Right? وهو يعني لفظ الشيطان من شطن يشطن إذا بعد. Right? So it's from the root شطن, which إذا بعد is to be distant. ويقال فيه شاطن وشيطان. And you can also say شاطن or شيطان in terms of the Arabic language. ويسمى بذلك كل متمرد من الجن والإنس. And they say this term shaitan is used for every rebellious one of both jinn and humans. من الجنة والناس. And we seek refuge in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surah An-Nas from من شر الوسواس الخناس الذي يوسوس في صدور الناس من الجنة والناس, from jinns and from people. Okay. والدواب, and animals that go out of control, who are out of control, who distance themselves from being in control, also referred to as shaitan. Right? Imam Shafi'i, for example, said that الساكت عند الحاجة إلى الكلام شيطان أخرس. Right? Or كما قال, that the one who's silent when some truth needs to be said is like a mute devil, shaitan. Because ابتعد فبعد عن الحق, that they distance themselves from what is true. لبعد غوره في الشر, because of how distant and deep they are in evil. So he gives some background explanation, right, on the word shaitan. Why? Because of significance. Because he's adu, فَاتَّخِذُوهُ عَدُوًا. Right? So take him as your enemy. Okay? وقيل من شاط يشيط إذا هلك. Another interpretive possibility is it's from شاط يشيط, meaning if one is ruined. فالمتمرد هالك بتمرده. So the rebellious one is in ruin because of their rebelliousness. Okay? ويجوز أن يكون مسمى فعلان لمبالغته في إهلاك غيره. And it's possible, lexically, that the one named with this pattern, فعلان, like shaitan, because of its mubalagha, because of how emphatic he is in ruining others. That's a little bit about the lexical meaning of shaitan. Okay. So he distanced himself from divine mercy. So Iblis himself is called shaitan because he distanced himself from divine mercy. And the role that he took on for himself is إغواء, is الإبعاد عن الهداية والابتداء, والخير. Right? Is to distance, is to turn away and distance from guidance and guidedness, and truth and goodness. Right? But of course, while the shaitan has a big marketing campaign, ultimately, a marketing campaign doesn't sell anything unless you buy it. So shaitan has advertising, you just have to have the right ad blockers on. Okay? Simple as that. And the less you hear advertising, the less you are likely to be influenced by it. So you have to know what things cause the wasawis of the shaitan, and you turn away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala from them. Okay? Um, and one of the keys they say is when one says is 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 التلفظ بالمعاني وليس بمجرد الألفاظ. That one utters meanings التلفظ بالمعاني المستحضرة. Right? Is to utter words that are present in your heart, whose meanings are present in your heart, not just by the mere words that we say. Our religion is not one of just of rituals, طقوس. What we do this, we do this. No, we mean it. Because it's meanings that are lived, not words. Okay. As Shaykh Abdurrahman الشاوري في المعنى يقول يعني يا نفس اقنعي لا تقنطي وعده حق حباك المصعدة. Says, O self, be content and do not have any despair, because the Beloved has given you the ways of ascent. Right? So the shaitan, we know he's our enemy, but we have the Beloved, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The way you deal with your enemies, to know you have an enemy, but to turn to the Beloved. That's all life is about. So one of the righteous said that if I could give all my dua to somebody, I'd give it to the shaitan. Why? Because the shaitan has been my greatest ally in my journey to Allah. Every time he pops up, reminds me, turn more fully to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The word he meant it as mubalagh, I didn't mean it literally. But all he has is waswasa. All he can do is whisper. So one just needs to ignore it. Right? السبيل في الوسوسة إنما السبيل في الوسوسة قطعها وعدم الالتفات إليها. Imam al-Sarakhsi said that the only way, إنما السبيل, the only way with the waswasa of the shaitan is to cut it off and to pay no attention to it. والرجيم مطرود باللعن. The rajim is the one who is cast away by being cursed. والحشوش جمع الحش. Right? And you can say الحش with a ضمة بالفتح والضم. الحش أو الحش. بستان النخيل في الأصل. حشوش originally refers to a garden of dates, of date palm trees. ثم استعمل في موضع قضاء الحاجة. Then it was used for a place where one would relieve oneself. So generally, people would have their basatin, their gardens, outside the town itself or the inhabited area itself. واختصارها واحتضارها رصد بني آدم بالأذى. And their being present is their being ready to attack humans through harm. Right? Right? So they wait for them. Right? Right? They wait for them, and رصدا it is ترقبه, that they are waiting to attack. Yeah, so they're present, they're waiting to pounce. And don't get freaked out. All they have to do is turn to Allah. Right? And one of the reasons they gather there, because it's a place where people uncover, and number two, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is not mentioned. Okay? And they're, shape the harm festers in darkness. Right? And the remembrance of Allah is light. والقضاء والفضاء يصير مأواهم بخروج الخارج. Okay? And al-Fadah, and open spaces becomes their gathering space when people relieve themselves. Right? So if someone goes to relieve themselves, they're present, but seeking refuge in Allah from them, distance is sort of, they're like superpowers. Like believers have superpowers, right? So to speak. Right? So someone goes in the middle of nowhere to relieve themselves, suddenly, it's like almost like comic book, right? Like the shayateen come. You say, Bismillah, أعوذ بالله من الخبث والخبائث, cast them aside. Because you're not moving anywhere. The seeking shelter, protection, fleeing is with the heart, but it causes them to flee. Right? Because when Allah is mentioned, the shayateen flee. So that was second adab, the isti'adah. And there's loads of meanings to the isti'adah. Once I was forced to teach a class with Sheikh Ali Hani in Jordan, and it took him 4 lessons to explain A'udhu Billahi Min Shaitan. I said, Sidi, you know what I would say after those classes? A'udhu Billahi Min Shaitan. I said, Leesh Sidi? Quran. First, it's not in the Quran, it's out. Number 2, you killed him. But all of this is needed to understand, to appreciate what A'udhu Billahi Min Shaitan Rajim means. And on the Seekers Arabiya site, Sheikh Ali has at least one article about A'udhu Billahi Min Shaitan Rajim. But these things are bursting with meaning. Okay. Third, وَيَجْلِسُ مُعْتَمِدًا عَلَى يَسَارِهِ. One sits relying on one's left. لأنه أيسر لخروج الخارج. And because that is easier in facilitating whatever comes out to come out. And this is easier if one is squatting, but the same is true slightly if one is seated as well. And معتمدا قليلا, slightly. So one places more weight on one's left than on the right. ويوسع فيما بين رجليه, and one widens between one's feet, and that applies when one's crouching, but also applies when one is seated. If you have your legs closed, then practically it's less facilitative of things coming out, and when they do come out, it is more likely that there will be najasa retention on everything, right, in our eat. يوسع ما بين رجليه, one widens between one's 2 feet. So these are practical things, and they're observed from what the Sahaba relate regarding the sunnahs of relieving oneself. وَلَا يَتَكَلَّمُ إِلَّا لِضَرُورَةٍ. One does not speak except out of necessity. We've highlighted before, the word darura is used in 2 ways. In a formal usuli way, which is in ما لا يحفظ الجسم أو ما لا يحفظ الجسم أو الأعضاء إلا به. Right? So that which the body or الحياة, right? النفس والأعضاء, that which is life, body and limbs cannot be preserved except by it. So life, body and limbs. Preservation of life, body is necessity. So you're not losing a finger, for example, is a necessity, right? But that's the usuli definition, right? So what allows, ما الذي يبيح تناول المحرمات القطعية. What is it that allows partaking of the things that are decisively prohibited, wine, pork, etc. It's ضرورة. It's the preservation of life and limb. And that's why, for example, you know the the traditional ulama overwhelmingly say, for example, riba is not permitted by just needs, hajat. Why? Because its hurma is qat'iyya. If anything, it's far more serious than pork or wine, etc. So one of the great Syrian scholars was asked about, well, if we're living in the West, can we buy a house on mortgage, etc., etc., etc.? He explained that something that's prohibited with hurma qat'iyya is not permitted for mere wants or needs. Tahsinat or hajat only permitted out of darura, out of genuine necessity. And the ضابط الضرورة is that which preserves life or limb. Right? And not other than that. So unless someone would be living on the street and would die, and even there, of course, there's another option to travel somewhere cheaper. أَلَمْ تَكُنْ أَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةً, Allah's earth not vast. There's no hadith that do not commute more than 20 minutes or half an hour. Anyone could live further away. These are all different things. There's no thing about thou shalt not rent, etc. And then he says at the end, وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي جَعَلْنِي وَالْحَمْدُ لِلَّهِ الَّذِي لَمْ يَجْعَلْني مِمَّنْ يَطْبُقُ الْفَتْوَى عَلَى حَسْبِ الطَّلَبِ. And all praises due to Allah who did not make me of those who cook up fatwas in accordance with people's wishes. Like, tell me what you want, I'll give you a fatwa accordingly. Okay? But that's darura in the usuli sense. The fuqaha frequently use darura يعني بمعنى الحاجة. Necessity يعني ما فيه نوع حاجة. ولو غير شديدة, even if it's not intense. Okay? Because you don't have to be, like, it's not that the house is going to collapse. So you're sitting on the toilet and you see cracks on the roof. So except for that, you can't. You know, your husband says, honey, I'm going to go buy the iPhone Max 512 gigabyte, and I'm getting you one as well. And I found a $250 leather case, I'm getting 2 of those as well. So you could say, stop please, wait till I come out. Okay? It's not a necessity, but it's a need. Okay? So here, لا يتكلم إلا لضرورة. لأنه يمقت به, because one is مقت, يعني one is derided and under displeasure for that. And there's hadiths about one of the most odious of things is for 2 people to be urinating next to each other, looking at each other, with their urine splashing all over the place while they're talking with each other. Hadiths about that. So and the hadith has many things. It's as if the Prophet is describing people at the urinal, but the act of talking in that is a sabab of maqt in the hadiths, or there's a bunch of hadiths related to that. But let's say you get stuck in the toilet, and let's say you have someone on your left and someone on your right. The person on your left took the water jug because they thought there's no one there. But they put it far away from you. And then you realize you don't have toilet paper, you don't want to talk to the person on the left. The person on the right, you just say, excuse me, could you pass some toilet paper over? But that's a need. It's not a necessity because technically you could just get up and walk away, as we saw from istijab, right? So, ويكره تحريما استقبال القبلة. It is prohibitively disliked to face the qibla. The main position, there's a few narrations from Abu Hanifa. ظاهر الرواية is كراهة استقبال القبلة مطلقا. Right? That is مكروه تحريما to face the qibla, absolutely. Outdoors and also indoors. And there's a number of other narrations, you can see the details in. And the istiqbal is prohibitively disliked, and the istidbar, giving one's back to it, is also prohibitively disliked. بالفرج, with one's private part, حالة على قضاء الحاجة, while relieving oneself. So there's, and he tells us about the istidbar in a second, we'll see. And he says واختلفوا في استقبالها للتطهير, and they disagreed about facing the qibla to cleanse oneself. But there's two acts: relieving yourself, then cleaning yourself. And it's very possible to separate the two acts. Even in some old homes, they used to, for example, where you relieve yourself, especially with the lack of active plumbing, the najasa is still kind of there. And some places, even with modern plumbing, with lack of water, in some places, it would be difficult to, if one relieves oneself, the najasa is still kind of there. So, but classically, and some of the pious would actually put two toilets in one, wondering like what, people share it, but they would actually relieve themselves in one, but then even when you get rid of the najasa, it's kind of there because very little water available. And they go to the other toilet for cleaning oneself. Now that's not facilitated, but like a bidet also, right? If you have relieve yourself, then have a bidet, that is a superior state then. So they differed on facing the qibla for purifying oneself, meaning from najasa. واختار التمرتاشي رحمه الله عدم الكراهة. And التمرتاشي, the author of تنوير الأبصار, on which الحسقفي wrote الدر المختار, upon which الطحطاوي wrote a حاشية, حاشية الطحطاوي على الدر, and after الطحطاوي ابن عبدين wrote his حاشية رد المختار إلى الدر على الدر المختار في شرح تنوير الأبصار. And التمرتاشي was a very significant scholar. He wrote an important commentary on his own text, تنوير الأبصار, called منح الغفار. But because of the greatness of الدر المختار of al-Hasqafi, it became somewhat ignored, even though al-Muhibbi, I believe, in his biography of the notables of the 11th century, he says, he described it as من أحسن شروح المذهب, of the best commentaries in the madhab, منح al-Ghaffar. And he's of those who are considered of the greatest of the mutaakhirin, of the later scholars of the madhab. And he's referred to as Shaykh al-Islam as well, because of the great rank. So واختار التمرتاشي عدم الكراهة Imam al-Tahtawi says this is a negation of karahat al-tahrim, la karahat al-tanzih. So facing the Qibla for purifying oneself, what is negated here, عدم الكراهة التحريمية, وتبقى, you say, عدم الكراهة, you could put as a note, التحريمية وتبقى التنزيهية, أو الكراهة التنزيهية. Right? Right? So it is still somewhat disliked. And this is, so Ibn Abdin and others mention this as well. وَيُكْرَهُ اسْتِدْبَارُهَا, and it is disliked to give one's back to the Qibla. لقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم إذا أتيتم الغائط فلا تستقبلوا القبلة ولا تستدبروها ولكن شرقوا أو غربوا. This is related by Bukhari and Muslim and others. So if one of you comes to the toilet, then don't face the Qibla nor give your back to it, rather turn a little to the east or turn a little to the west. Okay. So but they say you don't have to turn, because istiqbal is lil jiha, is for the direction. But if the toilet is built towards the Qibla directly, then it's just a matter of adab to turn a little away one way or a little away this way. It's not because out of adab, because you need al-mashaqqa tajlibu al-taysir. It's one of the principles of the Sharia. Difficulty bequeaths ease. Because it's not practically feasible, especially if you're using a toilet seat, but even if a toilet, like an Arabic toilet is built on the ground, not really feasible to face it sideways. It causes some complications. So one just turns slightly away from it and dislikes that matter in one's heart. He says, وَهُوَ بِإِطْلَاقِهِ مَنْهِيٌّ, and this is general. إِذَا أَتَيْتُمُ الْغَائِطِ, if you come to a place to relieve yourself, it's mutlaq. He doesn't say outside or indoors. So the mutlaq and the principle in the Hanafi school is المطلق يبقى على إطلاقه والمقيد يبقى على تقييده ولا يحمل المطلق على المقيد. That the unconditional text is left unconditioned and the restricted text is left restricted, and the unconditioned text is not limited by the conditioning text حيث أمكن, when possible. So the Prophet ﷺ, don't face the Qibla and don't give your back to it. And he says وَلَوْ فِي الْبُنْيَانِ, even in a building. And the reason being that Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhu relates that once he was on the rooftop of his aunt's house, and he saw the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam with his back to the Qibla and facing Bayt al-Maqdis, I believe, relieving himself. So from that and some other texts in the Shafi'i school, in an enclosed space, it is not disliked to face the Qibla or give one's back to it because of that conditioning text. Because in the Shafi'i school, the general text is conditioned by the conditioning text. But the response of the Hanafis would be, number one, an important principle related to things that happen in the Sunnah. They say, وَقَائِعُ الْحَالِ لَا عُمُومَ لَهَا. A specific incident cannot be generalized, especially if possibilities enter upon it. What are the possibilities? Because specific incident, there could be a reason, an excuse. It could be, due to circumstances. The wind could be blowing, could be just unawareness, could be لبيان الجواز عند الحاجة, could be notice someone's above, to just show that when there's need, it would be allowed. There's multiple possibilities that enters, which is why Imam al-Shafi'i himself, of course in a different context, he applied a principle related to وقائع الحال. He said واقعة الحال إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال. It's a word, if you can write the principle, it's worth writing out. It's beautifully expressed. واقعة الحال إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال كسيت ثوب الإجمال وسقط عنها الاستدلال. واقعة الحال, a specific incident. إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال, if possibilities arise regarding that specific incident. طبعا الاحتمال الناشئ عن دليل. It's a reasonable possibility, a possibility arising from with evidentiary basis. Okay? So let's say Zubayr walks into the women's washroom. You say, oh, he must have gone insane. Not likely. Forgetfulness is a more realistic possibility. Okay? I've been talking to someone about a thobe. There was a quiet time at Whole Foods. I said, okay, I need to go to the washroom. There's men, women, so I need to go to the men's washroom. End up walking to the women's washroom. Now, oh my God. Stepped out. There's no one there. There's a women's washroom. I was thinking of thobe, and I saw the women's sign, and I thought of a thobe. Right? And I was busy thinking about some problems of multitasking. Okay? But you couldn't say, oh, that's temporary insanity. That's a far-fetched interpretation. So واقعة الحال إذا تطرق إليها الاحتمال كسيت ثوب الإجمال. It becomes clothed in, it becomes mujmal, becomes non-detailed. We don't know what, why, how. We don't know what exactly is this meaning, how, why, what, why, how, why. قسيت ثوب الإجمال فسقط عنه الاستدلال. So it cannot be the basis of legal reasoning. Which is why they say, summarizing that, وقائع الحال لا عموم لها. Specific incidents cannot be generalized. Mean cannot unconditionally generalize.
Can you please repeat those principles?
واقعة الحال إذا تطرق إليه الاحتمال كسيت ثوب الإجمال وسقط عنها الاستدلال. So the Hanafi say, okay, that's واقعة حال لا عموم لها. That's a specific incident. All it does that if there's some excuse, then there's nothing wrong with facing the Qibla. لكن شرقوا أو غربوا, but turn a little away, left or right. Right? So then he says, and then he's referring to hadith here. وإذا جلس مستقبلا ناسيا فتذكر وانحرف إجلالا لها لم يقم من مجلسه حتى يغفر له. And if one does sit facing the Qibla, forgetting that one facing it, and one remembers, and one turns away, انحرافا يسيرا, turns away slightly, then one does not stand up from there except that one was forgiven because of the ijlal. Right? And Imam Tahtawi says, al-inhiraf, the turning away is from the jiha. Right? Or inhirafan yasira. Right? Right? So first he says, وَيَظْهَرْ, it would appear that you have to turn away from the direction, but then he says, ثُمَّ رَأَيْتُ فِي الزَّيْلَعِ, then I saw that الزَّيْلَعِ said, أنه يكفي في ذلك الانحراف اليسير, that it's sufficient to turn away slightly. وهو المختار, and that's what's chosen. And getting back to Shumali, كما أخرجه الطبراني رحمه الله مرفوعا, as related by Imam al-Tabarani in a hadith back to the Prophet ﷺ, not necessarily with that exact wording. Now, and here it should say al-Tabari. I think all copies of Maraqi al-Falah say al-Tabarani. What does yours say?
Old one says Tabarani, this one says Tabari.
Tabari. Does he have a footnote on it?
Yeah.
What does he say?
وقع في كثير من النسخ تحريف في كلمة الطبري إلى الطبراني والصواب ما أثبته كما في المخطوط وإمداد الفتاح.
Good. Good job. Okay, good. So some copies of the text itself, even actually Imam al-Tahtawi says that no, that it should be actually from Imdad al-Fatah, my copy's footnote.
I have a footnote about it.
Yeah. So that Imdad al-Fatah does mention it should be al-Tabari. Right? And that's what Imam al-Zayla'i in Nasr al-Raya pointed to. Okay. أخرجه الطبري. Al-Tabari, of course, there's a number of Tabaris because it was one of the lands of Islam and many. But Imam al-Tabari, the author of the great tafsir, was actually a great muhaddith as well. And he has a number of important works in hadith. Al-Tabarani is one of the great authors of collections of hadith. And they're of the most significant books outside the Kutub al-Sittah. has المعجم الكبير المعجم الكبير الوسط الصغير الأوسط والصغير. There are also other books, المعجم الشاميين and so on. And the most important books outside the Kutub al-Sittah were gathered in a brilliant book by Imam al-Hafiz Nuruddin al-Haythami with a tha. It's called مجمع الزوائد ومنبع الفوائد. مجمع الزوائد, where he took major works outside the 6 books. So the hadith that are related in a range of collections, and those hadiths are not found in the 6 major collections. So he gathered them and he gave a baseline evaluation of those hadiths. So it's very useful because of that. And there's a good edition of that, I believe, Dar al-Minhaj. It's not something you need to have right now necessarily, but it's good to be aware of these things. So for hadiths related by al-Tabarani, for example, where does one check as to the strength of the hadith? One goes to Majma' al-Zawaid of Nuruddin al-Haythami, who's a recognized great hadith master, and he'll comment upon that. And the critical edition of it is good, right? There's a lot of valuable hadith, especially on matters of virtues, etc. Typically the hadiths there, even if they have may have weakness, they don't have huge weakness, generally. Okay. ويكره إمساك الصبي نحو القبلة للبول. It is disliked to hold a child facing the qibla for the child to urinate, for example. Right? Because anything that is not, there's a legal principle whose wording is not exact, but the concept it highlights is important to say, ما لا يجوز فعله لا يجوز تناوله. That whatever you cannot do yourself, you cannot give to another. But the same thing applies. So that's the famous, it's one of the قواعد المجلة, right? One of the 99 fiqh principles mentioned in the Majalla. ما لا يجوز تناوله لا يجوز إعطاؤه. That which you cannot do yourself, you cannot give to another. But from that also is ما لا يجوز فعله لا يجوز تيسيره. Right? That whatever you cannot do, you cannot facilitate for another. Directly. Like you cannot, if you cannot face the qibla yourself, you cannot have it hold the child towards the qibla to urinate. Obviously. unless there's an excuse, like blowing wind, for example, right? And the and that's why they say ويحرم, it's a useful فرع, just right. ويحرم إطعامه وإلباسه محرما. It is prohibited to feed a child or give them to dress something that is prohibited. Right? And it's disliked to give them to wear something that is disliked. And of course, a child does not have the same hour as an adult, but it does affect things that for an adult would be blameworthy to wear, in terms of, for example, things that have inappropriate, like vile imagery and so on, and some of the cartoon things and so on. Some are wholesome, others certainly aren't. So one needs some little awareness. وَالْإِثْمُ عَلَى الْبَالِغِ الْفَاعِلِ بِهِ ذَلِكَ. And the sin is upon the adult who did that with them. Okay? I have a policy. If someone does weird things on social media, just unfriend them. Or if it's like, sometimes it's hard to unfriend someone right away, but if they repeat things. So recently I unfriended someone. There's something like, because now this thing, videos just automatically load up. Someone's kids are twerking on their front lawn. And then by the time I'm like going down to like figure out what I want to do, but to either do I unfriend them or what do I do with them? Then some neighbor joins in. Say little kids. That's like, so the child is not sinful, but the parents are for both allowing that action and everything that led up to the child doing that. ويكره استقبال عين الشمس والقمر. It is prohibited to face the sun and the moon directly, and this is when you can see them directly, not when they're blocked off, and not when you're indoors. لأنهما آيتان عظيمتان, because they're two of the great signs of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then he says, وَمَهَبُّ الرِّيحِ, right? وَيُكْرَهُ مَهَبُّ الرِّيحِ. It is disliked to urinate in the direction the wind is blowing, right? لِعَوْدِهِ بِهِ, because it will come back upon you. فَيُنَجِّسُهُ, so it will make one najis. This is if one is outdoors, presumably. وَيُكْرَهُ أَن يَبُولَ أَوْ يَتَغَوَّطَ فِي الْمَاءِ. It is disliked to urinate or defecate in water. Right? This does not refer to the toilet. This is in a pool of water. In a pool of water, whether large or small, or even a river. وَلَوْ جَارِيًا, because the Prophet forbade it. Okay? لا يبولن أحدكم في الماء الدائم. Let none of you urinate in still water. Okay? But الماء الدائم is like a body of water. Okay? ولو جاريا وبقرب بئر ونهر وحوض, even if it's flowing. Okay? Or close to a well, or a river, or a basin, a حوض. Okay? Or other places, غيرها من الأماكن التي يتأذى به الناس. Or other places where people would be harmed or hurt, or just أو يستقدرون استعمال المكان, or they would dislike using that place. They say, مصلى العيد. So people start using the musalla of Eid to relieve themselves. Then Eid comes, like, who wants to pray Eid there? Okay? Right? Or other places where there's harm, like between cattle. Right? For obvious reasons. وَالظِّلْ, and in shade. But this is shade that people use. Okay? الَّذِي يُجْلَسُ فِيهِ, that people sit under. Okay? وَالْجُحْ, and into a, how do you translate juhr? Like a little hole in the ground. Because it could be used by an animal. So you hurt the animal or you hurt yourself if the animal reacts. لِأَذِيَّةِ مَا فِيهِ, because you would unnecessarily hurt what is within it. Though interestingly, if one is, outside in land where the ground is hard, it is recommended to dig a pit to relieve oneself. One, so it doesn't splash. Number two, so that you don't hurt other people or animals. No, And number three, so then you can cover over the najasa. Okay? Especially in places where, or at the very least to loosen the ground, so at least you can cover it up a little bit. Okay? And that's why if you're in like nature, etc., you be away from walking trails, for example. If you come to like a convenient opening, other people might find that opening convenient too. And they may be somewhat inconvenient by the presence of your najasa there. لِيَذِيَّةِ مَا فِيهِ. But as for a hole in the ground, lest you harm what is within it, or lest what is within it harm you. And the masdar here can be understood in both ways. Right? And it's related that one of the early Muslims urinated in a little hole in the ground, and the jinn who lived there ganged up on him and killed him. And there's snakes and lizards and other things that may not take too well to being urinated upon either. وَالطَّرِيقِ, and a public path. Right? Even if it is fi nahya, even if it's a side path, like a trail in the woods, etc. The very fact that it's a trail means someone passes upon it. Okay? So, وَالْمَقْبَرَةِ, or a graveyard. لِقَوْلِهِ عَلَيْهِ الصَّلَاةُ وَالسَّلَامُ اتَّقُوا اللَّاعِنَيْنِ. Keep from the two sources of curses. وَقَالُوا وَمَنْ لَاعِنَانِ يَا رَسُولَ اللَّهِ. What are the two sources of curses, O Messenger of Allah? قَالَ الَّذِي يَتَخَلَّى فِي طَرِيقِ النَّاسِ أَوْ ظِلِّهِمْ. And he said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, the one who relieves himself in the path of people or their shade. وَتَحْتَ شَجَرَةٍ مُثْمِرَةٍ, or under a tree that bears fruit. لِإِتْلَافِ الثَّمَرِ, because you're ruining the fruit. Either actually ruining the fruit, or more likely, because then people, if you saw people relieving themselves under the fig tree, tomorrow would you want to go pick the figs and eat them? Probably not. And the figs that fall down from the tree, then you could wash them with. Would you want them served for breakfast? No, right? So obviously. And then we'll pause here for today, inshallah ta'ala. There's and complete the section next on the issue of urinating while standing. There's a number of other issues related to using the toilet, and then we'll finally get to the intervals of wudu bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. وصلى الله على سيدنا ونبينا محمد وآله وصحبه وسلم والحمد لله رب العالمين. So that's all.